Their carriers were almost empty. Ours were overloaded with vengeance. I stood on the flight deck of the USS Lexington that morning of October 25, 1944, watching our Hellcats and Avengers lined up wingtip to wingtip like angry wasps ready to swarm. The Philippine Sea stretched endlessly before us, deceptively calm under the dawn sky. But somewhere out there, Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet was waiting, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers that had once terrorized the Pacific, now sailing north like wounded animals, trying to draw us away from the real fight at Leyte Gulf. What they didn't know was that we were about to give them exactly what they wanted, and far more than they bargained for. My name is Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison, and I was a Hellcat pilot with Fighting Squadron 19. I'd been flying combat missions since Guadalcanal, had painted 17 rising suns on my fuselage, and thought I'd seen everything this war could throw at me. But nothing had prepared me for what we were about to unleash on the Imperial Japanese Navy. The morning briefing in the ready room was electric with tension. Commander David McCampbell, our air group commander and the Navy's leading ace, stood before a large map of the Philippine Sea. His weathered face was grim as he pointed to a cluster of red symbols roughly 300 miles northeast of our position. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the tobacco smoke and nervous chatter, "Task Force 34 has located the Japanese mobile fleet. 4 carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, plus escorts, light cruisers, and destroyers." A murmur went through the room. Zuikaku was the last surviving carrier from Pearl Harbor, a name that carried weight with every American pilot in the Pacific. "Intelligence reports indicate their flight decks are nearly empty," McCampbell continued. "Maybe 100 aircraft total across all 4 carriers. They're sailing north, probably trying to draw Admiral Halsey's fleet away from the main action at Leyte." He paused, letting that sink in. Then his eyes sharpened. "They picked the wrong fleet to play games with. We're going to hit them with everything we've got, wave after wave, until there's nothing left but burning steel on the bottom of the Pacific." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came before a big mission. Around me, pilots were checking their watches, adjusting their flight gear, making final notes on their knee pads. The air smelled of aviation fuel, sea spray, and the particular mixture of fear and excitement that hung over carrier operations. "Morrison," McCampbell called out, "you're leading the 2nd Division of Hellcats. Your job is to sweep ahead of the strike group and clear any Zeros that manage to get airborne. Then come back and strafe anything that's still floating." "Yes, sir," I replied, my throat suddenly dry. This was it, the chance we'd all been waiting for. A shot at the cream of the Japanese carrier fleet with overwhelming American air power. By 8 o'clock hours, the flight deck of the Lexington was a choreographed chaos of organized violence. Plane handlers in colored jerseys swarmed over aircraft like ants, making final checks, loading ammunition, topping off fuel tanks. The deck trembled under the thunder of 36 Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines warming up. I climbed into the cockpit of my F6F to 5H ELLC at T, serial number 42 to 7845, nicknamed Jersey Devil after my home state. The familiar smell of leather, oil, and metal surrounded me like an old friend. I ran through my pre-flight checks with automatic precision, fuel, oxygen, radio, gun sight, ammunition counter showing all 6. 50 caliber machine guns loaded with 2,400 rounds of death. The ship turned into the wind, and I felt the deck angle slightly as we picked up speed. Green-shirted catapult crew ran the final hookup to my aircraft. The flight deck officer or shooter held up 2 fingers, then one, then pointed forward. The catapult fired. In 2 seconds, I went from 0 to 120 miles per hour. The sudden acceleration pressed me back into my seat like a giant hand as the Lexington fell away below me. Then I was airborne, climbing into the morning sky with 35 other Hellcats from the task force. Looking back, I could see the entire might of Task Force 38 spread across the ocean like a steel city. 4 carrier groups: Lexington, Essex, Princeton, Langley, Intrepid, Cabot, Independence, and below Wood, plus their escort of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. More than 100,000 tons of American naval power, and every flight deck was launching aircraft. Within an hour, we had over 500 planes in the air. Hellcats, Helldivers, Avengers, and Corsairs, all heading northeast toward the Japanese fleet. It was the largest carrier airstrike in naval history, and I had a front row seat. We flew in loose formations at 15,000 feet, the vast Pacific spreading endlessly in all directions. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the ocean surface into a mirror of reflected light. My Hellcat purred along at 250 knots, the big R2800 engine running smooth as silk. Radio chatter was minimal, just position reports and course corrections from the strike coordinators. But I could feel the tension building as we closed the distance to the target. Every pilot knew this might be our last chance to face the Japanese carrier fleet in a decisive battle. At 10:30 hours, the call came over the radio that made every American pilot's heart race. Tally ho! 4 carriers bearing 040, range 30 miles. They're in a loose formation with escorts, hardly any cap in sight. I pushed the throttle forward and felt the Hellcat surge ahead. Through my binoculars, I could make out dark specks on the horizon that gradually resolved into the distinctive shapes of Japanese warships. The carriers were unmistakable, long, flat flight decks cutting through the swells, white wakes streaming behind them. But something was wrong. Where were the swarms of Zeros that should have been climbing to meet us? Where was the forest of anti-aircraft fire that had greeted us over every previous target? "This is devil-led," I called to my division. "Stay sharp. This feels like a trap." But as we closed to 20 miles, then 15, then 10, it became clear that this was no trap. The Japanese carriers were virtually defenseless. A few Zeros managed to get airborne, maybe a dozen total from all 4 carriers, but they were overwhelmed in minutes by our escort fighters. The truth hit me like a physical blow. We were about to witness the destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force, and they couldn't even put up a real fight. "This is Big Blue Leader," came the voice of Lieutenant Commander William Rawl, leading the first wave of Helldivers. "Commencing attack on the big carrier. All squadrons, select your targets and go in hot." I rolled my Hellcat into a steep dive, following the dive bombers down toward the Japanese fleet. The scene below was like something from a fever dream. 4 enemy carriers desperately maneuvering to avoid the rain of American bombs and torpedoes falling from the sky. Zuikaku, the largest carrier and veteran of Pearl Harbor, was turning hard to port when the first 1,000-pound bomb struck her flight deck. The explosion sent a column of fire and debris hundreds of feet into the air. Then another bomb hit, and another. Within minutes, her flight deck was a blazing ruin. I pulled out of my dive at 2,000 feet and lined up on a light cruiser that was putting up heavy anti-aircraft fire. My 6 machine guns roared to life, sending tracers streaking across the water. I could see my rounds sparking off the cruiser's superstructure, cutting down gun crews and starting fires. "Jersey Devil, this is Big Blue 27, came a voice over the radio. "That big carrier is listing bad. She's not going to make it." I looked back at Zuikaku and felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The great carrier that had helped launch the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor was dying. Her flight deck was completely engulfed in flames, and she was listing heavily to starboard. Tiny figures, her crew, were jumping into the water as the ship began her final plunge. But there were still 3 more carriers to deal with. Zuiho was next. The smaller carrier was frantically launching what appeared to be her last few aircraft when a flight of Avengers came in low on her starboard beam. I watched from 5,000 feet as their torpedoes hit the water and began their deadly run toward the target. The first torpedo struck Zuiho amidships with a flash of white water and flame. The second hit her engine room. The third blew a hole in her hull, so large I could have flown my Hellcat through it. She began settling by the stern immediately, her flight deck tilting up at an impossible angle. "Holy cow," someone shouted over the radio. "Did you see that? She's going down by the stern." Chitose and Chiyoda, the 2 converted carriers, were trying to escape to the north. But there was no escape from the hundreds of American aircraft swarming over the Japanese fleet like angry hornets. I joined a strafing run on Chitose, coming in low and fast with my guns blazing. The carrier's anti-aircraft guns were firing frantically, filling the air with black puffs of flak and streams of tracer bullets. but there were too many of us and too few of them. My round stitched across Chitose's flight deck, starting fires and destroying the few aircraft still spotted on deck. Behind me, Helldivers were diving on the carrier like hunting hawks, their bombs turning her superstructure into twisted metal and flame. Chitose lasted another 20 minutes before a direct hit on her aviation fuel storage sent a fireball climbing 1,000 feet into the sky. When the smoke cleared, she was listing so badly that her flight deck was almost vertical. That left Chiyoda. The last Japanese carrier was running north at flank speed, her escorts laying down a smoke screen and fighting desperately to protect her. But she was alone against the concentrated fury of the anti-American strike force. I had about 800 rounds of ammunition left and enough fuel for one more attack run. Looking down at Chiyoda, I could see her crew frantically trying to launch their last few aircraft. It was a hopeless gesture like throwing pebbles at a tidal wave. "All Hellcats, this is devil-led," I called to my division. "One more pass on the small carrier. Let's finish this." We dove out of the sun, 4 Hellcats in line abreast, our guns chattering death. My tracers walked across Chiyoda's flight deck from bow to stern, cutting down crewmen and destroying aircraft. The carrier's return fire was weak and poorly coordinated. Most off her gun crews were dead or wounded. As I pulled up from my strafing run, I saw a sight that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Chiyoda was burning from stem to stern, her flight deck buckled and twisted like a piece of discarded tin. But she was still fighting, still trying to launch her last few planes. Then the Helldivers arrived. Lieutenant Commander William Ellis led his squadron in a perfect dive bombing attack, coming down almost vertically through the flak and smoke. Their 1,000-pound bombs fell like thunderbolts, each explosion sending shock waves across the water. The first bomb hit Chiyoda's bridge, vaporizing her command structure. The second struck her forward elevator, blowing it completely off the ship. The third penetrated her hangar deck and detonated among the stored aviation fuel and ammunition. The explosion was so massive that I felt the shock wave in my cockpit 3 miles away. A pillar of flame and smoke rose more than 2,000 feet into the sky, and when it cleared, Chiyoda was gone. Simply gone. In her place was a spreading oil slick and floating debris. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, had been destroyed in less than 4 hours. By 1400 hours, it was over. The sea where Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet had sailed that morning was now a graveyard of burning and sinking ships. All 4 carriers were gone, along with a light cruiser and several destroyers. The few surviving Japanese ships were fleeing north at maximum speed, trailing smoke and listing badly. Our losses were minimal, 29 aircraft and their crews, a tiny price for the complete destruction of the Japanese carrier fleet. We had achieved what no naval force in history had ever accomplished: the total annihilation of an enemy carrier force in a single day. As I flew back toward the Lexington, my fuel gauge showing near empty, I tried to process what we had just witnessed. The Japan-Senevi's carrier aviation had effectively ceased to exist. After this day, they would never again pose a serious threat to American naval operations in the Pacific. But the cost in human life was staggering. Each of those carriers had carried between 1,200 and 2,000 men. Most of them were now dead or dying in the oil-slicked waters of the Philippine Sea. They had been our enemies, but they had also been sailors and airmen like us, young men far from home fighting for their country. The radio crackled with excited voices as pilots reported their fuel states and requested landing instructions. But there was an undercurrent of soberness in the chatter. We had just delivered a crushing blow to the Japanese war effort, but victory at sea always came with a heavy price in human suffering. Landing on a carrier deck is always a controlled crash, but it felt especially violent that afternoon as I caught the number 3 wire on the Lexington. My Hellcat slammed to a stop in less than 200 feet, the arresting gear straining against 14,000 pounds of aircraft and pilot. I shut down the engine and sat in the cockpit for a moment, listening to the metal tick as it cooled. Around me, the flight deck was a hive of activity as plane after plane trapped aboard. Deck crews swarmed over each aircraft, checking for damage, refueling, rearming for the next launch. But there wouldn't be a next launch against Japanese carriers. We had just eliminated them all. I climbed down from the cockpit and was immediately surrounded by mechanics and armorers, all asking the same question. "How'd it go, sir?" "It's over," I told them simply. "All 4 carriers are gone." Chief Petty Officer Mike Kowalski, my plane captain, whistled low. "All 4. "Sir, that's the whole Japanese carrier fleet, ain't it?" "What's left of it," I replied. "They couldn't have had more than 100 aircraft total." It was like shooting fish in a barrel. But even as I said it, I felt no satisfaction. Victory, yes. Relief that the war was closer to being over. But no joy in the slaughter had just witnessed. The debriefing in the ready room was subdued despite the magnitude of our success. Intelligence officers took notes as pilot after pilot described the destruction of the Japanese fleet. The numbers were staggering. 4 fleet carriers sunk, more than 3,000 Japanese sailors killed or missing, and the effective end of Japanese naval aviation. Commander McCampbell summed it up best. "Gentlemen, you have just participated in the most decisive naval air battle in history. The Japanese will never recover from this. Their carrier fleet is finished." What we didn't know at the time was that our attack on Admiral Ozawa's carriers was part of a much larger battle, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which would go down in history as the largest naval engagement of World War II. While we were destroying the Japanese carriers in the north, other American forces were fighting desperate battles against Japanese battleships and cruisers near Leyte. Admiral Kuraida's center force had actually broken through and attacked our escort carriers off Samar, sinking several ships before withdrawing. It was only later that we learned how close the Japanese had come to disrupting the American invasion of the Philippines. But our strike against the carriers had accomplished exactly what Admiral Ozawa intended. It had drawn Admiral Halsey's powerful task force 38 away from the main battle. The difference was that Ozawa had expected to trade his nearly empty carriers for time, giving Kuraida's battleships a chance to destroy the American invasion fleet. Instead, he had given us the opportunity to eliminate Japanese carrier aviation once and for all. The strategic implications were enormous. Without carriers, the Japanese Navy was reduced to a collection of surface ships with no air cover. They would never again be able to project power across the vast distances of the Pacific. For all practical purposes, the war at Zuiho was over. That night, as the Lexington steamed south to rejoin the main fleet, I stood on the flight deck looking up at the stars. The tropical air was warm and humid, filled with the smell of salt spray and aviation fuel. Around me, the ship hummed with the quiet efficiency of a crew that had just achieved the impossible. But I couldn't stop thinking about the faces I had seen in those final moments. Japanese pilots trying desperately to get their aircraft airborne, sailors jumping from burning ships, young men dying far from home in the darkness of the Pacific. War is about killing the enemy before he kills you. I understood that. I had accepted that day I pinned on naval aviator wings. But understanding something intellectually and living with the reality of it are two different things. We had achieved a great victory that day. We had shortened the war and saved countless American lives. The Japanese carriers that we destroyed would never again launch surprise attacks on American bases or threaten our invasion fleets. But victory always comes with a price, and the price is measured in human lives, theirs and ours. Lieutenant Junior Grade Bob Hensley from Fighting Squadron 15 didn't make it back to the Essex that afternoon. Engine failure on the return flight. Probably hit by anti-aircraft fire that he didn't report. He was 22 years old and had a newborn daughter he'd never seen. Ensign Tommy Rodriguez from the Princeton was shot down during the attack on Zuikaku. His Hellcat went into the water in flames, and no one saw a parachute. He was 19, the youngest pilot in his squadron. These were our guys, American boys who had volunteered to fly off aircraft carriers in the middle of the Pacific Ocean to fight an enemy that had attacked us without warning. They were heroes, every one of them, and they had died winning the greatest naval air victory in history. Their sacrifice, and the sacrifice of 27 other American airmen that day, had eliminated the Japanese carrier threat forever. It was a trade that had to be made, a price that had to be paid. But that didn't make it any easier to bear. As I write this account many years later, the full significance of what we accomplished on October 25, 1944, is clear. The battle off Cape Engaño, as historians would later name our attack on Admiral Ozawa's fleet, marked the end of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. After that day, the Imperial Japanese Navy never again launched a carrier-based airstrike. The 4 carriers we sank represented not just ships and aircraft, but the institutional knowledge and experience of 2.5 years of war. The pilots, maintenance crews, and ships companies that went down with those carriers could not be replaced. In the larger context of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, our victory was decisive. Although Admiral Kurita's battleships had briefly threatened the American landing forces at Leyte, the destruction of the Japanese carriers ensured that no coordinated naval counterattack could be sustained. Japan's ability to conduct major naval operations was finished. The war would continue for almost another year, but it would be a war of attrition rather than maneuver. Japanese naval forces would be reduced to kamikaze attacks and desperate last stands. Never again would they be able to mount the kind of coordinated carrier operations that had made them so dangerous in 1941 and 1942. We had flown 527 sorties that day and lost 29 aircraft, a ratio of better than 18-1. More importantly, we had eliminated 4 enemy carriers while losing none of our own. It was the most lopsided naval air victory in history, and it effectively ended the Pacific War's naval phase. But statistics, no matter how impressive, cannot capture the human reality of war. Every one of those Japanese ships we sank represented hundreds of lives lost. Every American aircraft that failed to return represented a family that would never be whole again. The victory was necessary. The victory was decisive. The victory probably shortened the war by months and saved thousands of lives on both sides. But victory in war is always a bitter achievement, purchased with the blood of young men who deserved to live long lives in peace. Standing on the flight deck of the Lexington that evening, watching the sun set over the Philippine Sea, I realized that I had witnessed the end of an era. The great carrier battles of the Pacific War were over. Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, and now Cape Engaño. These would be remembered as the decisive engagements that determined the fate of nations. Never again would hundreds of carrier aircraft clash in massive aerial battles over the open ocean. Never again would the fate of empires hang on the skill and courage of young men flying off pitching flight decks into the unknown. We had been privileged to serve in the greatest naval war in history, flying the finest aircraft ever built from the decks of the most powerful fleet ever assembled. We had fought an enemy worthy of our steel and had prevailed through superior technology, training, and industrial might. But more than that, we had prevailed because we were fighting for something worth dying for, the freedom of our nation and the liberation of peoples enslaved by militaristic tyranny. The Japanese carriers we destroyed that day had launched the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. They had bombed Darwin and Ceylon, had sunk the Lexington and Hornet, had terrorized the Pacific for 3 long years. Their destruction was justice as well as victory. As the Lexington turned south toward Leyte Gulf, I could see the lights of other carriers in Task Force 38 scattered across the darkening ocean. Each ship carried 3,000 American sailors and Marines, each one a volunteer who had answered his country's call. Together, we represented the industrial might and democratic spirit of the United States of America. We had just proven that no enemy, no matter how fierce or determined, could stand against free men fighting for their homes and families. The Japanese had attacked us at Pearl Harbor thinking that Americans were too soft, too comfortable, too divided to fight a long and bitter war. They had been wrong, catastrophically, decisively wrong. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of red and gold, and I thought about home. New Jersey seemed like another planet from this steel deck in the middle of the Pacific. But I also thought about the future, about the world we were fighting to create. A world where young men wouldn't have to fly off carrier decks to kill other young men. A world where the vast oceans could be highways of commerce rather than battlefields. A world where the terrible weapons we had unleashed that day would rust away in museums, reminders of a darker time when freedom hung in the balance. That world was still months away, still purchased with the blood of American boys yet to die. But after October 25, 1944, after the destruction of Admiral Ozawa's fleet, there was no doubt about the final outcome. We had broken the back of Japanese naval power, and we were going home. I survived the war, flew 47 combat missions, and shot down 19 Japanese aircraft. The Lexington survived too, serving until 1991 before finally being decommissioned and turned into a museum in Corpus Christi, Texas. Admiral Ozawa survived the sinking of his flagship Zuikaku and lived until 1966. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote that the mobile fleet sacrifice had been necessary to give Admiral Kurita's battleships a chance to attack the American invasion force. He never expressed regret for the decision, only sorrow for the lives lost. Commander McCampbell became the Navy's leading ace with 34 victories and received the Medal of Honor. He remained in the Navy after the war and died in 1996, one of the last of the great carrier air group commanders. Of the nearly 500 Japanese sailors who sailed with Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet, fewer than 1,500 survived. Most died when their ships were sunk or from exposure in the water afterward. They were buried at sea in the deep waters of the Philippine Sea, far from the cherry blossoms of home. The 4 Japanese carriers we destroyed, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, rest on the bottom of the Pacific at depths of more than 12,000 feet. They are war graves now, protected by international law and the passage of time. Sometimes I wonder if the ghosts of the young men who died aboard them have found peace in the darkness of the deep ocean. I returned to New Jersey after the war, married my high school sweetheart, and raised 3 children. I worked as a commercial airline pilot for 30 years, flying passengers instead of bombs, creating life instead of taking it. But I never forgot that October day in 1944 when Admiral Halsey's fleet unleashed hell on Japan's last carriers. I never forgot the young American aviators who died achieving the greatest naval air victory in history. And I never forgot that sometimes, in the darkest moments of human history, free men must pick up weapons and fight for the survival of everything they hold dear. We did our duty that day. We served our country with honor. We helped win a war that had to be won. And we came home to build the peaceful world we had fought to defend. That may be the greatest victory of all.